The answer is, early in my career, a senior colleague told me as an academic I should be aware of the following, and it's been borne out to be fairly true now in 15 years of teaching, which is that you can either, if you write something, either it's turns out to be obvious or it's wrong. But those are really the only two choices you get, something that's either obvious or wrong. And either is okay as long as it's interesting. And what I hope that the Gridlock Economy insight offers is something that is ultimately obvious, because there really is nothing new. So yes, the Gridlock Economy is a form of transaction cost. But that isn't a very helpful thing to say in and of itself, right? Because when you say something is a transaction cost, you want to know, how does it operate? Can we reduce those costs? Where do we go to look for them? And what the gridlock image, I hope, gives you is a new way to think about a particular kind of transaction costs, one that's pervasive, but really had never been discussed. This is a discovery that I made about an area of loss, of huge loss of life, of loss of economic opportunity in our economy that simply hadn't ever been noticed before. And the discovery that I made isn't this notion of loss in general, but it's a specific kind of loss. And it's a loss that I call the tragedy of the Anticommons. In order to understand gridlock, you need to have a set of conceptual tools. So part of why I came up with the gridlock image for describing this problem is that we're all pretty familiar with gridlock in traffic. We've all sat in traffic jams. So what ownership gridlock is the economic equivalent of sitting in a traffic jam. Every driver individually behaves pretty rationally, but when you have 50 people trying to turn left at once at one intersection, everyone gets stuck. And it's the same with ownership. We have an image that owners generally try to do the right thing, and that's right. Every individual owner is trying to do the right thing, but we set up an ownership structure or ownership system where the interaction of those individual reasonable people is that they all get stuck. The drug patent owners can't agree. The license owners for Spectrum can't agree. The little landowners can't agree. So we don't get drugs or wireless or airports. So ownership gridlock is a little bit harder to see. And here's a way that I've come up with to try to make that invisible problem, the invisible problem of gridlock, more visible. It's a conceptual tool. It's really, if you're going to take away one image from this interview, the one that I want you to take away or one tool from this interview, it's the notion of a tragedy of the Anticommons. So what is a tragedy of the Anticommons? It's the term that I coined to describe the problem of too many owners leading to too little prosperity. And the way to get there is to sort of go in steps. So most of us are familiar with the notion already of a tragedy of the commons. When we have the ocean, we all take fish out and there's no more fish. That's a tragedy of the commons. Or we all put pollution into the air and the air gets polluted. That's another tragedy of the commons. Any resource as to which there are too few owners, we often will see overuse and destruction of that resource. So that's a really familiar problem. And you can see the pollution, or you can see that there aren't any fish left. And the usual solution to tragedies of the commons, of which there are thousands all around us, is to create private ownership. Private property has been viewed as a solution for generations, since Aristotle, actually for thousands of years, because when there's a private owner, you have some real reason to conserve. So say you own the lake, then you don't take all the fish out today. You leave some so you can fish for tomorrow. So private property tends to be a system, doesn't just create wealth for society, but it's also a great tool for conserving scarce resources. So we have this notion that if you have a commons, if you have overuse, if you have waste of some resource, the solution is privatize. And that's been a solution that we've seen in the fall of the Soviet Union, in transition in Eastern Europe, in our approach to drug research. We've seen it throughout the modern economy. Privatization is the solution to overuse. Here's the danger. Privatization can overshoot. It used to be thought that you had a spectrum of ownership, commons at one end and private at the other. And anytime you have a commons, you tend to see overuse. So you solve it by moving towards private property. And what I discovered is that you can actually go right past private property. You can start with commons, get to private, and go right past it to what I call anti-commons property. So in a commons, you have too few owners and you have overuse. In an anti-commons, you have too many owners and you have underuse. Underuse can be just as costly. It's hard to see, but it can be just as costly as overuse. So the example of missing drugs, that's an example of underuse of the discoveries that we've made. The example of missing wireless broadband, it's an example of underuse of our spectrum. So underuse is out there, it's costly, it's hidden, because it's examples of anti-commons tragedy are all cases where something doesn't get invented, doesn't come to market, where the air traffic delays don't get fixed. They're all counterfactuals. So what the tragedy of the anti-commons does is link together or make visible or give a way to describe a set of a framework for a whole set of problems that all of us live in every single day, that are linked in ways that weren't previously understood to be linked. So when the notion of the tragedy of the commons was coined, that's a term that Garrett Hardin made up just 30 years ago. When he coined the term the tragedy of the commons, that is what sparked one of the main sparks of the environmental movement in this country. The notion of the tragedy of the commons made it possible for people to see that hundreds and thousands of different environmental problems in land, in air, and water, and species protection were all the same problem. And once you could see that those were all problems under the heading of a tragedy of the commons, you can begin to work towards solutions from one area to the other. And my hope has been that with the tragedy of the anti-commons, it's sort of the same way. That once you can see that all these different problems that seem very different in the economy, how is rap music and drug research the same? Well, they're all examples of tragedy of the anti-commons. And once you see that, you can begin to start thinking about solutions.